Good morning, Professor Mangot, and many thanks for agreeing to seeing me today.
Good morning. It's nice to have a conversation again.
So today I would like to talk about the Middle Eastern region, which is currently finding itself split between the alliance facilitated by the US administration under Donald Trump with the Arab states and Israel included, and Iran. The latter has been violating the terms of the de facto non-effective nuclear deal agreement of 2015. Now Tehran is stepping even further by acting in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran became party of in 1970. So I would like to start with the prehistory of this issue. What do you think were the reasons that have influenced the Donald Trump's decision in 2018 to leave the JCPOA Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
Well, the Republicans in the United States had been in opposition to the deal that Obama signed back in 2015. So when Trump became the president of the United States, it was clear that he would go after the JCPOA, and the Trump administration mentions three specific reasons for why they would no longer stick to the JCPOA. The first reason are the so-called sunset clauses, meaning that in the nuclear deal of 2015, Iran has taken over obligations that have a time limit. They will run out after 8 years, 10 years, 15 years. And yet Trump administration argued that's not acceptable, that we have these sunset clauses in the JCPOA. Secondly, the Trump administration insisted that the JCPOA should be broader, including also the ballistic missile program of Iran. And it should be broader also to include what the Trump administration called the malign activity of Iran in the region, in the Near and Middle East, supporting proxy militias in Iraq, in Syria, in the Lebanon, and in Yemen, for instance. So these three reasons were given by the Donald Trump administration why they withdrew from the treaty. Iran still stuck by its obligations for 1 year, but after additional sanctions were imposed by the US on Iran, in May 2019, Iran finally decided to violate its obligations under the JCPOA step by step. And that's where we are at the moment.
Since you already mentioned the malign activity in the region that Iran is reportedly undertaking, the position of the State Department is to use the JCPOA as a platform for the further pressure, for the further possibility to influence Iran. How can you imagine that?
Well, the Biden administration takes the position that the renewal of the JCPOA should be achieved in negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran. The Biden administration, in principle, accepts that the Trump strategy of maximum pressure on Iran has failed. The Biden administration also thinks that the agreement that should be concluded with Iran on the basis of the JCPOA should be broader, stronger, and longer. And about expanding the set of obligations of Iran and having the sunset clauses postponed into the future, the Biden administration thinks that if the JCPOA is in place again, then negotiations need to take place between the P5+1 and Iran on the missile program, on the sunset clauses, and on the malign activity of Iran in the region. Iran has declared that it's not interested in such negotiations. It does not want to expand its obligations under the JCPOA or any new deal with the P5+1. But I think for the Biden administration, there should be a clear decision first to go back to the JCPOA, to make the United States a partner in the JCPOA again. But although the Biden administration, Biden himself, Blinken, Sullivan, stressed that they are interested in renewing the JCPOA, The US insists that Iran makes the first step. Iran should get in compliance again with its obligations under the JCPOA. If Iran does and is again in compliance, then the United States will abandon the sanctions. And the Iranian position is no. The US has withdrawn from the JCPOA, so if Biden wants to have the JCPOA in force again, then the United States should first re-enter the JCPOA, and if the United States so does and lifts the sanctions, then Iran will get in full compliance with its obligations again. So unfortunately, at the moment we have a situation when both sides demand from the other side to take the first step. And that, I think, is a game of chicken that is not very helpful given the relevance and importance of a nuclear deal with Iran for the security in the region.
Exactly. You have referenced already the order. Basically, the US was the first country which has withdrawn from the deal in 2018. And now its representatives claiming Iran should be the first one to reverse those steps and to refrain from taking the others. And only then the United States would follow suit. Don't you think it's somewhat arrogant of Washington to demand from Iran to taking first steps?
Well, at least to a certain extent, it's contradictory when the claim by the Biden administration is to renew the JCPOA. And given the fact that the United States left the JCPOA in May 2018, there should at least be a parallel process of the US starting with lifting some sanctions and Iran taking reciprocal steps to return to some of the obligations of the JCPOA. It's a highly unrealistic option that Iran, particularly given the hardline position of its leader, Ali Khamenei, and the future most likely hardline conservative president, will indeed accept the expectation by the Biden administration that Iran first has to get in full compliance. That's not a realistic option. So the Biden administration needs to decide, are we serious on reviving the JCPOA, hoping that we will have further negotiations about further restrictions of Tehran's activity in the region and on the nuclear program? Or if it wants to continue the maximum pressure strategy of Trump, which obviously has failed. There are some hardliners in the Biden administration who think that Iran is about to collapse economically and consequentially politically. And they think we should not make the first steps. But I think this is a very dangerous policy and it doesn't add to the credibility of the United States.
It is true that Tehran has insisted that Washington ease sanctions before Iran will resume compliance with the treaty. Recently, there have been hints from the foreign minister of Iran at a way to resolve this impasse over who goes first by synchronizing of the steps. Still, United States State Department reacted quite coolly without rejecting this offer, though. Would you say it is a fair solution to synchronize those steps?
I think the proposal by the Iranian foreign minister is very reasonable. He calls it a synchronized process of step-by-step decisions of both sides. I call it a parallel process. I think that's the only face-saving way for both sides to go ahead and return to the JCPOA, regardless of whether it will then be possible to have an additional agreement, broader, stronger, with Iran. So synchronizing the process should be the solution for the current impasse. I'm a bit worried that the United States government is not replying to such a proposal positively. And what adds concern to the position of the United States, the Biden administration, is the fact that the Biden administration wants to include in close consultations Israel and Saudi Arabia on the way ahead with regard to Iran's nuclear program. This will make it much more difficult to find a solution with the government of Iran.
According to Antony Blinken, Iran is only months away from being able to produce enough fissile material for production of nuclear weapon. But should Tehran continue lifting constraints imposed by the nuclear deal of 2015, this could get down to a few weeks. Keeping in mind the fact that currently Iran is discussing opportunities to rejoin the JCPOA quite actively with Qatar, for instance, do you believe Tehran is actually interested in development of its nuclear stockpile?
Well, as a matter of fact, it was the Trump policy of withdrawing from the JCPOA and the subsequent decisions by Iran no longer to comply with its stipulations that has produced a new situation where Iran is about 4 months close to produce highly enriched uranium, which is needed for a nuclear weapon. So it's about 4 months now. Under the JCPOA, it was more than a year. But at the same time, we need to state that it's one thing to produce enriched uranium, which can be used for a nuclear weapon, and to produce a nuclear weapon. There's a difference between these two capabilities. And in order to produce a nuclear weapon, experts think that Iran still needs about 2 years to get to that capability. If Iran is really interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, I would say in principle yes, because they have seen the experience of Iraq, of Libya, and the threats to North Korea. About their nuclear weapons program, the policy of regime change that the United States has pursued and still pursues in those countries. So Iran feels threatened, the regime feels threatened, and it's quite acceptable to say that if Iran had nuclear weapons, there would not be any more military threat to Iran by either Israel or the United States or both. So in principle, yes, for security reasons, for the security of the regime, the acquirement of nuclear weapons is advisable to Iran. However, I think so far Iran has been open to negotiate about this capability of producing nuclear weapons for the lifting of sanctions. So there's a good chance that Iran will really stop all its violations of the JCPOA if sanctions are lifted. And that's what we need to achieve. Go back to the JCPOA and have the guarantee for at least some years that Iran will not enrich uranium to a weapons grade level. So negotiations with Iran, the revival of the JCPOA, are of utmost importance.
To sum up your words, would you say it's correct to claim that for Iran, it's more important to lift the sanctions rather than establishing its own nuclear arsenal?
I would think so. At least for the midterm future, Iran is really willing to have a cap on its nuclear program, as agreed in 2015. We should take the chance to return to the deal to make sure that Iran does not acquire and build a nuclear weapon. That's the only way out. And I think if the United States lifts the sanctions, Iran would immediately return to its obligations under the JCPOA. But the United States need to take the first step, followed immediately by the first step of Iran. And as long as the Biden administration doesn't accept that logic, we are running out of time.
Let us imagine the negotiations between the United States and Iran become active one day. What do you think about this alliance between United States, Israel, and a number of Arab countries in the region? Will this alliance endure those negotiations, this transformation of attitude towards Iran, or will it collapse eventually?
I don't think so. I think the alliance can really be kept up, though we have to state that it's not all Arab countries which want to be part of that coalition against Iran and its activities in the region. Countries like Qatar and Oman, for instance, are trying to mediate at the current moment between the United States and Iran about how to escape the current downward spiral. But I think the US will keep on sticking to its alliance despite the more moderate relations of the US with Saudi Arabia. But the United States realizes that this close alliance with Israel and most of the Arab states is useful for putting pressure on Iran. So I think the alliance will be kept. However, if the demands from some members of this alliance, like Israel and Saudi Arabia, for a longer, stronger and broader agreement, if this demand will be met, I'm not certain about it, because Iran has signaled it's willing to return to the JCPOA, but it is not interested in any further agreement, which means broader, longer, stronger obligations by Iran. That's what Iran has rejected in the past several times, and I don't think that Iran will change its position on this.
Well, which country do you think is the least interested in re-establishment of the relations with Iran within this alliance?
Well, I think it's three. It's Israel on the one hand, and then it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. These three countries are most strongly opposed to the JCPOA. They have made that clear already when this agreement was signed in 2015. They do not like Washington to return to the JCPOA. They would rather see the strategy of maximum pressure that Trump had started to continue to bring down the Iranian government.